And she'll tell you more about herself, and the title of her talk is The Increasing Violence and the Resistance of the Urmi and Hakkari's Assyrians, 1900 and 1915. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to speak about the Assyrians of Iran, the Iranian Assyrians, because they are from the church, Assyrian Church of the East, who was and which is the Iranian Church. And now there are only 10,000 Assyrians and Chaldeans and evangelical Presbyterian in Iran, but we have to give testimony about their history, and thank you to give me this opportunity. No one can deny that the massacres of the Christian populations, Armenian and Assyrians, in eastern Anatolia in the Ottoman Empire, and in western Azerbaijan, like you can see west of Urmiya Lake, in 1915, were due to the intention of the leaders in Istanbul to displace and exterminate Christians from the Ottoman Empire. For this reason, these massacres fall within the definition of genocide. In Iran, the massacres committed the west of Urmiya Lake in Iranian Azerbaijan did not occur in the same way that they did in Anatolia. They start in January 1915 and were repeated again in July 1918 and May 1919. And in May 1919, the Ottomans were no longer located there. So other causes are obviously responsible. The letters and documents, and particularly the Iranian documents and Iranian letters from the period, show that there are a variety of factors which triggered the massacres on both sides of the Turkish-Iranian border. The position of the Christian villages at the crossroads of the increasingly weak empires, Russian, Ottoman, and Persian empires. The turmoil in these societies, with their challenging the absolute rule of the leaders, the takeoff of nationalist movements and aspirations, Armenian, Turk, Assyrian also, and finally, the World War during which violence reached its peak. Yes. At first, I give some remarks about the increasing violence before World War. The massacre which took place in the Urmiya region led to the deaths of between 40,000 to 50,000 Armenian and Assyrian Christians who were living in the village to the west of Urmiya Lake and along the river which flow from the Kurdistan mountains. In addition, a little over 70,000 Assyrians from the Hakkari, you see the tribes in the Hakkari region. From the Hakkari tribes, Ashirat tribes and Rayat tribes, who were living among Kurdish tribes and perpetuating a tribal system that dated from the 15th century, were also caught up in the massacre. A step above the Maleks, at the head of the tribes, was the Patriarch Marshemun of the Church, Patriarch of the Church of the East, who had earthly rule over the tribes and spiritual rule over the Christians of his church. And you can see he lived in Rochanes, and Rochanes was a little far from the tribes. He was outside the tribes, facing Julamerk, where lived the Kaymakam, and which is now Hakkari in Turkey. The mountains were not a barrier. And see, it's the mountains from Mawana, from Telgawer in Iran. The mountains were not a barrier to the movement of people and goods, and the Christians from Hakkari and Azerbaijan often traveled to the Caucasus and to Tiflis. And what happened in Hakkari region was immediately known in Urmiya region. The upsurge of violence along the Turkish-Iranian border since the end of the 19th century is also witnessed in the assassination of the Bishop of Urmiya Ardishay, Marga Auriel Gabriel, in 1976, ordered by the Chair of Neri, in the assassinations of Christians by the Kurds in the Hakkari Mountains, as well as the impunity the groups of Kurds benefited from when they raided villages in the plains. These raids were often carried out by lower-level Kurdish leaders from Hamidiyeh battalions, which the Iranians did not have the resources to fight against, and which the Ottomans did not prevent even when they occupied the region between 1907 and 1912, to December 1912. It's very interesting to note that the Christian inhabitants of Urmiya organized their own defense, the Armenians with the Fedai, but the Assyrians chose 4 bigger villages. Yes, there are the village in Urmiya, 4 bigger villages where the population could flee for safety when rid of Kurds, and which were defended using weapons provided by the Iranian governor. And these Assyrians were from the Terkaver district, and they were the first to resist the Kurdish raids. So, before the war, the violence continued to increase constantly on both sides of the Turkish-Iranian border throughout the first decade of the 20th century, but the population organized themselves to fight back. And I think very strongly that the Christians still stood tall on the eve of World War I. My second point is about the 3 months at the end of the year 1914. When the Ottomans entered the war alongside the Germans on November 1914, the Iranians declared they would remain neutral. So they should have stayed out of the war if their territory, and in particular between Caucasus, Urmiya region, between Caucasus, Anatolia, and the Kurdish mountains, had not constituted such extremely high stakes from a strategic standpoint for those countries at war. The Russians had invaded the province of Azerbaijan since 1907, and they had positioned their troops along the border, replacing the Ottoman troops in December 1912. They were before ready to attack the Ottomans, and now, today we know that the Russians not only wanted to occupy Azerbaijan, but also East Anatolia. And when François-Georges Picot and Sir Mark Sykes, the agreement, Sykes-Picot, went to meet Sazonov, the Russian foreign minister, in 1915 to present the project for Syria and Iraq and so. And Sazonov answered, yes, okay, but I want that the Russian border will be pushed to Urmiya and Bitlis. And you see, Russia has had projects to not only to occupy, but to enter these regions inside Russia. And for this project, we guess, Russian went many emissaries to Mar Shimun, to Patriarch Mar Shimun in Khochanes, in 1913 and in 1914, and this supported the rumors and the importance of the rumors, which claimed wrongly, I think it was wrong, that the Patriarch and his family was allied of the Russians. And these rumors further strengthened the rumors spread by the Young Turks about the alleged relations between the Armenians and the Russians. And what we saw yesterday with this letter from Talat Pasha to the Valley of Van comforted this position. And if I have some minutes, Dr. Shed, who was in Urmia, Presbyterian in Urmia, went to pay a visit to Marsh Moon in 1913. And on his way to Khochanes, from Urmia to Khochanes, he remained, and he was invited by Kurd, chieftain Kurd, who told him, attention, Marshimun is told to be allied of Russia. And Dr. Shed came back to Urmia and he wrote a letter, a very important letter, in which he pointed that perhaps there would be possible massacre only because of these rumors. You see. In October 1914, groups of Kurds and inhabitants of the Iranian Sunni village, because this is the problem of Sunni and Shia villages in Azerbaijan, along the border, attacked the other Iranian village, and not only Christian villages, but also Shia villages. They were pushed back by the Russians, and the battalion made up of Christians, mysterious Christians from Yerevan and Georgia. Leaders of the Sunni village were hung by Russians. The Assyrians in Urmia were armed by the Russians and paraded in the streets of Urmia behind Ara-Petros, yes, asserting their attachment to the Triple Entente. The Valley of Van, who was Tassin Bey, with authority over Hakkari, had asked Marshmoon to commit himself to not taking sides with the Russians. Marshmoon then consulted the Maleks, at the head of tribes, and the Patriarch's family was divided in opinion. Some wanted to remain faithful to the Ottoman, others had seen the massacres elsewhere and wanted to Russian protection. In December 1914, the Christians from Al-Baq were massacred by the Kurds, while at the same time, the Ottoman troops led by Enver Pasha fought the Russian troops in Sarikamish. Sarikamish is north Lake of Van. Which side would be victorious was uncertain. Then the Russians called back their troops from South Bulak and Urmia to the north, and on January 2nd, 1915, and the Ottoman army entered the city of Urmia on January 4th, 19. It's my third part. What happened to the Christians in January? The Christians in the village were taken by surprise and mercilessly massacred by Kurds and Chetes and Sunni villagers. In fact, here we can see that the extermination plans designed by Enver and Talat Pasha were being put into motion, entrusted to the hands of the special organization Taxilate Marsus, criminals recruited as Chete. Each regiment was thought to work with. And we'll see exactly the same in July 1918. Those Christians who were able attempted to follow the Russian army to the Caucasus in spite of the snow and the cold. Almost 10,000 Assyrians were able to reach the Caucasus this way. And descriptions were made by Armenians and by Lazarists and who were with them. I have no time to give the description. Approximately 18 Christians, other Christians, abandoned their village and sought refuge at Presbyterian and Lazarist missions in Urmia. They remained there until the return of the Russians on May 24. Many of them died from disease, but they were tolerated by the Ottoman commanders and protected by the leaders in Urmia and by the Afshar of Urmia. Dr. Packard from Presbyterian Mission was able to save 1,200 Christians who had sought refuge in the big village of Göktepe under siege by the Kurds, because he had cared for members of their families. However, he was unable to save almost 100 Christians who were assassinated in Golpashan by the Kurds and the Iranian revolutionary. I give you some. There are the Christian villages. Another example, 150 Christians were arrested by the Ottomans. Yes, I know, if I can have 5 minutes. By the Ottoman Lazarist mission at that time. 44 of them only were kept in custody and then shot. They were apparently the organizer of the resistance when the Ottomans occupied the region between 1908 and 1912. The other example of the genocide is the savage murder in February 1915 of Christians who had remained in the Salmas Valley by Jevdet Bey, the new Valley of Van. In May, the Christians came back from Caucasus to Urmia. At the same time, is the lake, I think, in the lake of Urmia now, and no problem. The map of the town of Urmia during the First World War, the Christian quarter was east or northeast of the town. And it's a picture taken before World War, and the roofs of Urmia. It's Marshmoon, Benjamin. And there are a picture from before the World War. There are the Christians from Tergaver, from Mawana, fighting the Kurds, or going to find the Kurds. Yes. And I see. At the time, the Christians, just 3 minutes, were returning to the plain of Urmia. The Assyrians from Hakkari were being attacked by Kurdish and Ottoman troops. Faced with the increased attacks and assassination of the Kurds, the deportations of Armenian and Assyrian, the massacre of Christians from Gawar, that you can see here, this map was drawn by the Chaldean Patriarch in 1844. The massacre of Christians from Gawar, the implementation of the action devised in Istanbul against Christians, Marshimoon was forced to turn to the Russians for help. His decision was apparently made on May 1915, if Surma, the sister of Patriarch, is to be believed. The Kurdish tribes tried to block the Assyrian tribes. An attack by the valley of Mosul, Hyder Bey, was stopped by the tribes. Just Lisan was taken, not, I have another. You can see Lisan of this map. Just here, in June, Marshimoon went to Salmas and to Mohanjik to ask the Russians for help. He met the General Chernozubov, who promised his support, but which never came. During the summer, The tribes were surrounded by the Kurds and the combined action being taken by Haider Pasha from west and Cevdet Pasha from northwest. They fled to the mountain peaks, you can see there. Mahmoud again called on the Russians for help, and he sent emissaries to Urmia and Tabriz in July. He knew that there was no time to lose. The tribes fought 6 heroic battles in August to protect families, and they had an exodus to the north to Bashrale when the Russians were camped. From there, the Assyrians crossed the border in October 1915. In Iran, they were welcomed by the Russian consuls and not by Iranians, because Azerbaijan was a Russian province, and relief committees organized by the Russians and the Americans. The tribes were then dispersed in the Salmas, Roy, and Urmia valleys. And we have some many details about this dispersion. And the patriarch and his sister Suma were in Dilmahan, who is nowadays, today, Salmas. Their exodus became their exile. And I stop there, but there are many things to tell. Thank you.
So the title of my paper was A Clean Sweep, the purging of Assyrians from Hakkari, but I've added in brackets the attempted, because there are still many traces there, as you will find out. Now, before 1915, the Hakkari highlands held the world's largest concentration of Christian Assyrians. Today, their descendants are estimated to number more than 600,000, scattered in nearly 50 countries on 6 continents. None of them, however, actually live in Hakkari, which has been devoid of Assyrian communities since 1925. This paper, drawing from a number of sources, will endeavor to briefly outline the historic presence of Assyrians in Hakkari, detail their expulsion from the region between 1914 and 1925, as well as describe the area and its inhabitants since the catastrophic events that transpired. Issues such as the resettlement of Assyrians elsewhere and the settlement of Kurds in Assyrian villages will also be discussed, along with the impact of this separation and appropriation. The paper will further highlight the importance of preserving the Hakkari region's historical and cultural legacy, as well as the question of properties and ownership of cultural monuments. So, just to show another slide to illustrate how Assyrians in the diaspora from Hakkari have maintained memories and cultural traits from that region. So I thought I'd briefly start with a little note on Assyrian origins in Hakkari. Previously, it was largely believed that modern Assyrians settled in Hakkari as a result of the refugee influx from Mesopotamia caused by the Mongol invasions in the 13 to 1400s. There is, however, enough evidence to warrant an ancient Assyrian presence in that area as early as the 2nd millennium BC, when Hakkari was a strategically important area wedged in between the Assyrian Empire and the kingdom of Urartu. It was first mentioned during the reign of Shalmaneser I, who conducted numerous military and looting expeditions in the region, conquering it from the local peoples of Nairi and Hubushkia. His son, Tukulti-Ninurta I, subsequently boasted the epithet King of the universe, King of Assyria, King of the upper and lower seas, so lakes Van and Urmia, and all the Nairi countries. By 715 BC, Hakkari comprised an important border province between Assyria and Urartu, centered around the centers of Bitkari and Shabarda, and it remained so for at least a century. So there you see, this is the area of Hakkari right here. The yellow is the Urartian kingdom, and the green is the Assyrian Empire. And that was where the crossover happened. So, indeed, The Akkadian name, Bitkari, refers to a custom house at a trading post where taxes and dues are collected, and a karu was a trading station or trading colony or community of merchants. This name has survived as that of at least 3 locations within the modern province of Hakkari until today. So that name is still the name of 3 villages within the province of Hakkari. Additionally, the names of scores of other locations in the province derive from either Akkadian or from Aramaic, which were both the languages of the ancient Assyrian Empire. So I believe that it was during this time, therefore, that Assyrians from Mesopotamia in the south began to settle in the region. So here you see a brief list of some of the place names in Hakkari, and these are actually Kurdish villages. These villages were not Assyrian villages, but you see the origins of their names. So the Assyrians are believed to have built vital infrastructure in the area to facilitate agricultural activities, trade and communication, as well as military activities further afield. They paved highways through the mountain valleys, cut tunnels and stairways in the cliffs beside the rivers, built guard towers and fortresses on mountain tops, as well as cut irrigation channels into the rock, built aqueducts, one of which you see here, built aqueducts and created stepped terraced fields along the mountainsides. Indeed, this ancient people were well known for their engineering prowess, as well as extensive use of aqueducts, exactly the same form, to channel water into their capital at Nineveh, using terraces for their gardens and agricultural needs. Furthermore, the name Hakkari itself is believed to derive from the Akkadian word ikkari, or the Syriac word akkare, meaning farmers or agriculturalists. The Arabic equivalent of this name, fallah, eventually became fallah, which the nomadic Kurdish tribes called the indigenous people they happened to find on the land. The Assyrians, on the other hand, have always known themselves as Suraye, which is a development of the Akkadian term Asuraye, meaning citizens of the Assyrian heartland. This was later translated into Armenian as Asuri, into Persian as Asuri, by which the Christians of Hakkari are known in the 16th century Kurdish chronicle, the Sharafnameh, and later into Arabic and Turkish as Suryani. The province of Hakkari served as an important center of Christianity over many centuries. According to Armenian and Syriac sources, Christianity was first brought to the area by Saint Bartholomew the Apostle, who was martyred in the 1st century, and whose tomb, which you see pictured, served as the focus of an important Armenian monastery and pilgrimage site until 1915. Indeed, the churches in the Hakkari highlands testify to the antiquity of its Christian Assyrian communities, many of them dating to the 4th and 5th centuries AD. It should be noted that, since the very beginnings of Christianity, the Assyrians of Hakkari came under the jurisdiction of the Church of the East. Sometime before 1610, the patriarchate of this church was fixed at Kochanas, as Florence mentioned, where it persisted for just over 3 centuries. From the 16th century onwards, those Assyrians who joined the Catholic Church became known as Chaldeans. By 1830, their patriarch had established itself in northern Iraq, and missions were founded in Hakkari during the 1890s to convert the Assyrians there to Catholicism, with minimal success. Protestants, under the Presbyterian Evangelical Church, had established themselves in the region earlier, with missions sent from Urmia establishing stations as early as 1842. So here you see one example. This picture was taken in Urmia before the genocide, and this is an Assyrian from Gawar who was a prominent Protestant. Prior to 1915, there were roughly 150,000 Assyrians of all denominations residing in 280 villages and towns of that province, and comprising about 50 to 60% of the population of the current, what is now the current province of Hakkari, not the old borders. So just some old photographs showing you a little bit of the lifestyle of the Assyrians of Hakkari before the genocide. Prior to the First World War, the Assyrians of the Hakkari highlands in Turkey had shown no enmity towards the Ottoman authorities, especially following a meeting which took place between Patriarch Marshamun Binyamin, which you see depicted here, and Tahsin Bek, the governor of Van, on the 3rd of August 1914, where a number of promises were made to keep the Assyrians of that province loyal. At the same time, soldiers were being conscripted from amongst the Assyrians. From August onwards, the Assyrians of frontier districts were beginning to flee to the Urmia plain in Iran due to attacks from the Ottoman military, which had been reported to be arming Kurdish tribesmen whilst confiscating weapons from any Assyrians which they were able to do so. Wholesale massacres of Assyrian villages by Ottoman troops returning from the Russian front were also being reported. Despite Assyrian attempts to remain loyal to the empire, the situation worsened, and by November 23, the Patriarch, as both spiritual and temporal head of his people, was forced to inquire from the Russian vice-consul at Tabriz whether or not to commence hostilities against these unwarranted attacks, which were now understood to have become part of what we know as the Assyrian genocide. The Assyrians of Hakkari became fully aware of the atrocities being committed against fellow Assyrians and Armenians in the Urmia region throughout January 1915, and in April, new massacres by Ottoman authorities began to occur around Van and Hakkari's northern fringe, so the districts of Gawar and Albaq. Between April 12th and 17th, an assembly between the Patriarch as well as Assyrian chieftains and lay leaders of the various Hakkari districts was convened, resulting in an order for general mobilization against the apparent threat. And in June, the Patriarch himself set out for Tabriz to meet with the Russian consul in order to request military aid and protection. This was taken by the Ottomans as a declaration of war on the part of the Assyrians, and they began attacking them from all sides from the 23rd of June 1915 onwards. These coordinated attacks were led from the south by Haydar Pasha, governor of Mosul, and from the north by Jevdet Bey, the new governor of Van, as well as by the chiefs of many neighboring Kurdish tribes who tried to close the Assyrians in, as Florence mentioned. On July 27, the Patriarchate at Qochanes fell, and its defenders and remaining inhabitants fled. Some 2 weeks later, the Patriarch returned from a meeting with the Russian military, bearing the grim news that they would be unable to provide the Assyrians with any assistance. They had no other hope of survival but to flee to Iran, where they could be protected. So, here you can see, again, same picture of Urmia. The hopes of the Hakkari Assyrians were finally dashed when on September 14, their last district finally capitulated. The Patriarch personally commanded and led the refugees and survivors on their trek to Persian territory, and only 50,000 made it alive. This nightmare, however, was not over, since Ottoman troops continued to pursue and attack the Assyrians in their Persian safe haven. Here you can see some photographs, archival photographs of the Assyrians while they were refugees in Urmia. At the end of July 1918, the Assyrian forces again capitulated and they were forced to flee south towards the British lines at Hamadan, from whence they were transported to a specially prepared refugee camp at Baquba in Iraq. So here you can see, this picture actually comes from the Australian War Memorial Archives. This is actually a photograph of the refugees, the Assyrian refugees, as they were fleeing from Urmia to Iraq. And there you see a picture of the Baquba refugee camp. After the camp's closure in 1921, many Assyrians chose to return to their former villages in Hakkari. Their fate, however, was sealed in September 1924 with the delineation of the boundary between the modern states of Iraq and Turkey, the so-called Brussels Line, and the final expulsion of Assyrians from Hakkari. This followed the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne, which recognized the sovereignty of the Turkish Republic and made no mention of the Assyrians, let alone provide for guarantees for their rights as a minority within that state. From then on, the Hakkari Assyrians turned to Iraq and the British Mandate authorities there for protection and resettlement. In time, many of them ceased to view their areas of resettlement as foreign, since they were part of a contiguous area that became viewed as the traditional Assyrian homeland, and those areas were already home to indigenous Assyrian communities. So, since 1915, despite not having returned to Hakkari in 90 to 100 years, the region continues to form a cornerstone of the identity of the Assyrians who originate from there. As one of my informants once put it, you can take the Assyrian out of Hakkari, but you can't take Hakkari out of the Assyrian. Therefore, as they began to settle in new host countries such as Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Iran, and the former Soviet Union, the Hakkari Assyrians proceeded to reinforce their pre-existing social structure in more concrete terms. This was achieved using a two-pronged approach that was both geographical and religious at the same time. Primarily, wherever Hakkari Assyrians resettled, they tended to group themselves according to their original villages and tribal districts. This tended to occur more successfully in a rural setting and had its origins in the segregation imposed on Assyrians cantoned at the British-run Baqoba refugee camp. So, this system was subsequently adopted in the settlement of the Assyrian refugees in Iraq after 1922, and here you see, for example, people were settled in various villages according to Baz, Upper Tiari, Lower Tiari, Jilut, Khoma, etc., where they came from in Hakkari. And also later in Syria after the Semele massacres of 1933. And I should say that these villages were largely destroyed by ISIS in February of this year. So here are some more archival photographs from National Geographic showing those first Assyrian refugees that were settled in Khabur in 1933. So along with these rural settlements came the re-establishment of pilgrimage centers based around places of worship which had existed previously in Hakkari, as well as the adoption of religious hierarchies within a new setting. We notice, therefore, Assyrians of a particular village or tribal district building new churches named after those in their former places of habitation. Thus, these new spaces were not only haunted by their former homes in Hakkari, but they came to articulate two separate but intimately linked realities. So, for example, these churches are in Syria, the Mar Odishu Church of Tel Tal and the Mar Odishu Monastery in Tal itself. Mar Qochanis Church in the village of people from Qochanis, and the actual Mar Shalita Church in Qochanis. So, Marzaya churches, the Marzaya Church, Marsawa Church in the village of Diz in Syria, and the Marsawa Church in the original village in Diz. So, it shows you how the memory was rebuilt. Again, Marsawa, Qaddishta, Qalayata, Qaddishta. This one is in Tel Tamar. Actually, this is one church that was completely destroyed by ISIS, Marbishu, and this is the original Marbishu, which is also in ruins. At the same time, the ecclesiastical organization of the Church of the East was maintained to a large extent through to the 1970s, with the sees of its two main prelates, Mar Khnanishu of Shams Dinan, and who you see on the left, and Mar Sergis of Jilu, who you see on the right, having been relocated indefinitely to Baghdad. So there you see both successors, Mar Khnanishu and Mar Sergis, at the opening of the Marzaya Church in Baghdad in 1959 with Iraqi President Abdul Karim Qasim. Today, Mar Sergis, the current Mar Sergis, who you see here in an earlier picture, currently resides in retirement in Modesto, California, and it represents the last surviving link in this religious hierarchy that had once prevailed in Hakkari. While Hakkari Assyrians often perceived religious prelates as their leaders, those who especially belonged to independent tribes maintained their own secular chiefs. To some extent, tribal and village leadership structures were also retained, with each new village being led by its own Mukhtar or Reyes, and the title Malik being retained even today as an honorific one. Among those upon whom this is still bestowed is Zaya Malik Yaqub, who is the son of this gentleman here, Malik Yaqub, whose ancestors were the Maliks of the Upper Tiari tribe. That person has been a deputy in the Syrian parliament, representing constituents in the province of Al-Hasaka, and continuing his family's prominence since 1961. Within an urban setting, however, the dynamic was a little different, and this particular pattern of social formation was most successfully achieved in Iran and the former Soviet Union, where groups of Assyrians from certain geographical areas tended to flock to the same city or neighborhood, so as to live within close proximity of one another. The most successful of such groupings belonged to Hakkari Assyrians of the Jilu tribe, who created Jilu quarters or neighborhoods in such cities as Baghdad, Kirkuk, Tehran, Tbilisi, and even Chicago. Within this setting, however, the establishment of churches based on those in the former homeland was more of a rare occurrence. Here you can see one church of Marzaya that was built in the Jilu quarter of Baghdad in the 1920s. Hakkari, therefore, maintained its role in identity formation and the Syrian refugee communities in Iraq and Syria through placemaking, where former homes were reconstructed and reformed in totally different places, as well as the adaptation of communal institutions and the pre-existing leadership to new surroundings. Such patterns of resettlement strengthened the individual social identities of the Hakkari Assyrian diaspora, leading them to maintain their specific dialects of Aramaic. The rural setting especially facilitated the continuation of customs they had brought with them from their mountain homeland. Nevertheless, most Hakkari Assyrians have been able to remember not only such details as which villages and districts they originate from within their homeland, but also their individual clan names and family histories, which are essential to their identity. Just a little about the Kurds. It goes without saying that the local Kurds have lived for the greater part of a century without their once numerous neighbors, yet with the constant visual and orally transmitted memory of their former presence. Previously, the Assyrians were part of a structural relationship of tribal alliances which kept the balance between them and neighboring Kurdish tribes, known as the Bazika system. The relations were so strong between some of the Assyrians and Kurds that to have joined the Assyrian exodus from Hakkari in 1915 and again in 1924, when the Assyrians went to Iraq. With the forced removal of the Assyrians from Hakkari, the local Kurds were met with a vacuum. Many Kurds which had originally belonged to Assyrian tribes prior to 1915 have since been reassigned new tribal identities and have joined new tribal confederations. Additionally, districts and valleys which were previously inhabited solely by Assyrians were slowly repopulated by Kurds either from neighboring tribes or those from surrounding districts, such as Beit al-Shabab, as well as refugees from Iraq or Iran. The physical absence of Assyrians, however, remains contrary to the reality which prevails on the ground in Hakkari. Assyrian churches and houses can still be seen across the province even today, and the Assyrians remain rooted in the stories, songs, and oral traditions of the area, as well as in folklore, handcrafts, and traditional designs, in much the same way that Hakkari has remained a strong element of the culture of émigré Assyrians. Moreover, family ties, severed by distance and by assimilation, remain with the descendants of mixed Assyrian-Kurdish marriages, largely as a result of the genocide, still searching for their long-lost relatives who may well survive abroad. Despite the interest and curiosity, there has been almost no rapprochement or engagement in the past century until very recently. And I put this picture up because this is the family of Haji Muhammad, who is known as Haji Muhammad Bab Falah. Haji Muhammad, son of a Christian, and his father was an Assyrian from the Tkhuma tribe. And I've actually found his relatives in Chicago. This is another family that approached us this year, last month in May when we visited Hakkari. And they actually approached us and they told us that their father's name was Hurmuz and that he was an Assyrian from the district of Norduz. So this is one of Hurmuz's sons, and this is another one of Hurmuz's sons. So they're half Assyrian. And they're still looking for their families. So I'm just going to my conclusions. Last July, I began a Facebook fan page, Assyrian Hakkari and Botan, which now has over 3,700 likes. Initially, I had conceived it as a forum where I could post current photographs of former Assyrian villages and churches in Hakkari, as well as some historical black and white images from the region. My aim was to connect Assyrians with roots in Hakkari to an area which they had never visited, and to provide a visual stimulus with which they could connect to the abstract ideas they had been raised with, and recognize the familiarity of those unfamiliar places. Within the first few months, the response was overwhelming, and here you can see some of the analytics of the page. I began receiving not only responses from Assyrians all over the world who became emotional when they saw their ancestral places of origin, but also from Kurds who were eager to reconnect with a people they knew only from legends and abandoned stone structures, but whom most had never met in person. I should note that their greatest confusion was as to whether or not Assyrians were actually Kurds, and they were surprised to find that while sharing many songs, dances, and foods, the Assyrians indeed constituted their own ethnic group and did speak a different language. Such encounters, as well as similar moves from other individuals and organizations, have brought about increased awareness and support for the restoration and preservation of Hakkari's historical and cultural legacy. Now, there are moves for the establishment of an Assyrian foundation in Turkey that can, with the cooperation of Kurds and others on the ground, take ownership of sites and raise money for their restoration. This is important now more than ever, since many of these monuments have been slowly destroyed by treasure hunters over the past 2 decades, and here you can actually see before and after shots of the same monuments. These are within the last 15 years. These are being destroyed by treasure hunters, and this craze has consumed many locals and even visitors from elsewhere who appeared to be brainwashed that the Christians had buried gold in their abandoned churches before they left in 1915. It should be noted that for the first time last year, for the first time in 90 years, a prelate of the Assyrian Church of the East, Margiwargis Sliwa, the Metropolitan of Baghdad, Iraq, with the help of the Assyrian-Turkish parliamentarian Erol Dora, who you see here, who was meant to be here, met with local authorities. So this is, for example, the mayor of Hakkari. So they met with the mayor and they met with the local provincial governor in order to lobby for the restoration of Assyrian religious sites for faith pilgrimages and historical tourism. This also raises the question of properties and ownership of such cultural monuments and whether or not they should now belong to the Turkish Cultural Ministry, local authorities, or the Church of the East, even though it has no real presence in Turkey. Last month, this is the last couple of slides. Last month, in commemoration of the centenary of the Assyrian genocide and the expulsion of the majority of Assyrians from Hakkari, I organized a pilgrimage tour to the region. For the first time, I led a group of 7 people, mostly Assyrians, through district after district over a 15-day tour during which people were able to visit villages, pray and light candles and incense in the ancient stone churches which had been neglected for a century, as well as meet people of mixed Assyrian-Kurdish ancestry and Kurds who were eager for more future cooperation with a people they had never met, but who seemed so familiar to them. For a rare moment, Assyrians and Kurds once more ate, drank, and danced together, and it seems as if a new door has been opened to honest dialogue and rapprochement. Of course, I could go into more detail about this experience, as well as my experiences from 2 or 3 other trips I've made to the region in the past year, but that is a topic for a future presentation. Thank you very much.
Now, I'm in the position where a previous distinguished speaker covered most of my material. So, I'm not going to repeat events that you already heard about. I will make 2 remarks, though, and then I will jump to page 9 and then page 13 of my presentation. And hopefully, I will try to cover material that haven't been discussed yet. Now, the first remark is that we commemorate in 100 years since Sayfo, 1915, but I think other scholars have pointed out 1915 was neither the start nor the end of a long period of a process of atrocities that were committed against the Assyrians. And in many respects, the 1909 Adana, at least as far as young Turks' ideology is concerned, the Adana massacres of 1909 should be taken as a starting point. And the massacres of the Assyrian people continue right up to post-Republic period. It happened in Hakkari as well as in Troy Abdin area up to 1926. During this long period of atrocities, Assyrians defended themselves the best they could. And in this talk, in this paper, I wanted to list the instances of resistance which I have been able to identify. But you've already, I think, extensively heard these two instances, two regional resistance that occurred. One is the Hakkari around 1915, and then the second stage, again involving Nestorian Assyrians, so-called, as well as Chaldean of the plains in Urmia, so in 1918. So 1915 to 1918 has been a long period of resistance by Assyrians originated in the Hakkari region, and then later joined by the Rayat, so-called again, by brethren in the Urmia plains. So I had quite a lot of details in relation to that, and I can discuss with you if you like further, but I think much of the material has been competently covered by other scholars. So, and as I said, so I'll jump right to the 9th page of my presentation, because I have examined a lot of Turkish sources in relation to Hakkari and Urmia. It's amazing how much information you can find. Now, the Ottoman military had the habit of naming resistant forces as either bandits, gangs, çete for those who speak Turkish, or rebels, RC. Those who speak Turkish would know that the word rebel doesn't translate accurately the tenor of the word in Turkish, RC. In the English version, the word rebel, I believe, has some romantic or even noble connotation. You know, one who's rebellious seems like mostly as a positive thing. But in Turkish, RC is a totally negative concept, has got the meaning of being a traitor. So such references to Assyrians in Ottoman documents and memoirs of officials from that period are numerous and gives us an indication of Assyrian resistance during the long period of atrocities. So paradoxically, one of the best sources, or at least I'd say useful sources of information about Assyrian resistance are the official Turkish military publication about the First World War, which are numerous. And it includes memoir of Ali Ihsan Sabi's 4 volumes, who was later interned in Malta for crimes against humanity, that is, massacres against Armenians and Assyrians. Now, in those publications, the narrative is fairly predictable. Assyrians, or Armenians for that matter, are rebels, that is, RC, traitors who cooperated with foreign imperial powers and so on, even if the Ottoman Empire and the Germans were empire as well, but cooperating with other empires was a treacherous act. And but if you filter this layer of information, if you filter it and you go to the next level of information, you can still find useful information about pockets of Assyrian resistance. So a lot of the Turkish publication, including Ihsan Sabi's, who was the commander of the 4th Army Corps, who attacked Urmia in 1918 and forced them towards Hamadan. And if you layer that information and then you compare it with sources such as Aga Petros's memoirs, as well as British sources such as Wigram, you'll find that even though the interpretation is obviously different, there's convergence of incidents. So the Turkish sources talk about the Nestorian Armenian forces in Hakkari. This is in that period. They don't know the exact numbers, but they do know that there was a formidable force, and they do talk about not being able to defeat them until they brought the 4th Army Corps and with the assistance of the Kurdish Simko and tribes in order to defeat the Assyrians. So that's all I'm going to say about Hakkari and Urmia. But I think we also have to talk about other Assyrians, and that's in other regions. So it wasn't just Hakkari, and it wasn't just Urmia, where Assyrian resisted. And it wasn't only the so-called Nestorian or Chaldean Assyrians. It was also in the Trabzon area, the Syrian Orthodox and Catholics also resisted the Ottoman Empire the best they could. The sources, of course, are scant. It's difficult to find them. But we have some information about, especially from Ibrahim Kaspo, which some of you may be familiar with. He was an Armenian Catholic from Aleppo, but originally was from Mardin. In his memoir, he identified 5 villages in which, in his words, put up heroic battles to defend themselves against the scourge, despite the enemy's overwhelming numerical and strategic superiority. These villages were Bınebil, Midyat, Ainvardo, Azek, and Besibrina. So we'll start with the village of Bınebil, only about 250 Syrian Orthodox families, and I do apologize if I didn't pronounce it properly. They, having heard the massacres happening in the village of Gölye and Manshuriye, they made preparations to defend themselves. They were engaged in several battles against the detachments sent by the Ottomans, and there was a siege of 1 month. The village inhabitants, at best, they could muster 120 to 150 able men to fight, whereas the opposing force numbered 4,000 to 16, depending on which stage of the battle. Even if we take the lower number of 4,000, it's not an even battle. And the villages, they eventually managed to barricade themselves in the monastery of Deir al-Zafaran, and the siege continued from June to October 1915. Eventually, I put the term the resistance paid off, but what I'm going to tell you after, just kind of contradict my statement, is that only 20% of the inhabitants remained. So the resistance, it helped at least that the village was not, inhabitants completely not wiped out. The other village, Besibrina, which I mentioned earlier, the village notable Melik Hanna Haido, also alarmed by the massacres perpetrated by in the nearby villages by both Kurds and Ottoman army, started making preparation of defense of the village. So they knew they had no other choice but to defend themselves. Kurdish tribes were mobilized against them, and the village, they had stationed 40 soldiers of the Ottoman army, and they attacked them, and they robbed them, and this way they got some advantage by getting some ammunition from the Ottoman army. The siege was, by the Ottoman army, was a detachment by Ömer Naci Bey. Maybe you have heard of him. Ömer Naci Bey was on his way to Persia. He also attacked Hezak, and those who've read about Hezak, you know, is probably an operative of Teşkilat Mahsusa. And so he had orders to attack these villages. He had a force of 1,000 against a small village. Despite that, the battle lasted several months. So these 2 villages, I have unable to find other information other Ibrahim Kaspo, other than the source of Ibrahim Kaspo. But Kaspo also mentioned Azak, Ainvardo, and Midyat. About those 3 places, there is corroborating sources, including in the Ottoman archives. As I said, paradoxically, you have to layer, this is useful information, but you have to look at it from they look at this from the different interpretation. So there are a couple of telegrams reproduced in Military History Documents Journal, it's Turkish Askeri Tarih Belgeleri Dergisi, gives us an indication of the extent of Assyrian resistance in the region. The first Sayfo, dated 22nd July 1915, states, the 11th Army Corps was informed that the Midyat Christians rebelled, and I emphasize, and dared to use arms against soldiers with force and started skirmishes with gendarmes. So as I said, it's a different interpretation. They're regarded as traitors, as Asi, as the word is used. But we can see that there is a rebellion in Midyat, which the Turkish sources acknowledge. The second Sayfo, sent on 4th of August 1915 by Süleyman Faik, who was the Army Corps commander, and he sent the Sayfo to the command of the 3rd Army. He states, it's been submitted that the rebels in Midyat were suppressed. The town was cleared off them. And that they still, though, in the 30th and 31st of July 1950, there were about 500 rebels still fighting. No other information is provided, but we, as we can see with Ibrahim Kasper material, as well as these two ciphers, that the Assyrians in Midyat defended themselves to the extent of their resources. The Syrian Catholic Patriarch Rahmani, in his report to the Paris Conference, stated that the Christians indeed took refuge in Midyat, where they organized resistance against the troops. Now, this information is reproduced in the Courtois seminal book, and page 188, and you can read that. And I've noticed the publication that was produced for this conference has an article by my good friend Jan Bert Sauerse, which is a German translation of his study entitled The Fall of Midyat. I will also encourage you to read that, because it identifies two places in Midyat which resistance was very strong. One is the monastery of Mor Charbel, and the other one the estate of Adoka family. And also, Jan also gives the information that given that Midyat had underground tunnels, a lot of Assyrians escaped using these ancient tunnels, and they escaped to Ain Warda. So I will, Ibrahim Kasper gives us a little bit more information, and he does talk about casualties on both sides. So obviously both Assyrians and the Ottoman regulars and Kurdish regulars were killed in this battle, and the district chief Sarif Effendi was also attacked, and he was killed by the Assyrian forces. The final battle lasted a week, I think, and then it's around June 1915. Eventually, of course, the superior numbers of the opposing forces gained the upper hand. And the other thing is, of course, the problem of ammunition. The Assyrians ran out of ammunition. They used some homemade cartridges, which prolonged the battle for a few days, but this was not to avail. Eventually, they fall, and massacres were ensued. Men, women, and children were murdered. Those who could escaped to Ainward. Now, other villages also escaped to Ainwardo. There was a clear convergence in Ainwardo of Assyrians escaping massacres elsewhere in Tur Abdin. In 2012, Musa Fall, who was 105 years old at the time, talked about Sayfo and to a journalist. He was from Upper Kafro. He had some memories of 1915, although he was a little boy at the time, 7 or 8, I think. And he talked about his own experiences under attack by Muslims. And what I took from that interview was not only that his memory was still vivid, and he said the memory of 1915 still haunts him at the age of 104 at the time, but that also it gives the information that many Assyrians escaped to Ain Wardo. And they even sought assistance from Ain Wardo, where Ain Wardo Assyrians sent their detachments to some villages in order to be able to help to the best of their ability. Now, I think there's a speaker which will talk about Ain Wardo, so I don't want to cover too much of that information, and I think it'll be better if more extensive material is presented later. But I want to point out an official publication in 1954 is published by Zeki Teoman. It was published for the Republican Party, which was the only party, since it was one party state at the time. And the publication is entitled The People of Savur, How They Assisted in the Ainvert, that is Ain Wardo incident. Now, as I said, this is provided by the point of view is that Ain Wardo, or Ainvert in Turkish, have rebels, and therefore they needed volunteers from villages around to collect Turkish and Kurdish, even Muhallimi for those who know, Muhammad tribes. And so volunteers, he said, they were collected from different places and they attacked Einwardo. But they also say that they attacked Midyat, and his explanation is that when Suryani in Midyat heard that the Russians were approaching, they ceased to recognize the Midyat government administration. So, and they leveled, then they surrounded the town and slaughtered many people. So, from their perspective, the Assyrians were committing massacres with a few resources they had. But, what the official publications say that the people who attacked Einwardo and Midyat for that were heroic in their battles because Suryanis were hailing bullets. I don't know how many bullets the Suryanis could have had in that period under siege, although, as I told you, they tried to melt anything they could made of lead in order to turn it into bullets. But they don't, how much of that metals could they have? So they can only extend for a few days. So it's obviously exaggerated, but still useful for us, as I said. If you filter the kind of the first layer, we can see the convergence of the material that, yes, the Einwardo people defended themselves heroically. Well, I have translated this, and you can find this on the internet, but it's rather long. It's over a page and a half. But the one comment I want to use from that one sentence, Zeki Teoman says that in order to scare us, the Russians, the Assyrians would shout at us, "The Russian swagger is coming. Let us see what you're going to do." And I think I interpret that when the Assyrian Suryanis run out of bullets, they start using psychological warfare, not having anything else. The best I could is just try to tell them there's a bigger danger coming. You know, I'm a small force, but the Russians are coming. Well, the Russians didn't come, of course, but at least they may have gained a day or two out of that incident. Well, brutally, I'm told I only have 5 minutes. Thank you. So I'll leave Abraham tomorrow to talk, well, today I think, to talk about Lachto, but I will make an honorable mention of Hazak, and I think David, David is there. David written extensively about Hazak, and I think it's well known. There are much more resources than the other places that I've mentioned, and so it's well known that Hazak was very well defended, and then as a result, Ömer Naci Bey, who was the commander of, well, he was commander of all these detachments who attacked these villages, eventually had to leave to Persia and leave Hazak people alone. But one of the military archive documents say that he had orders that the Assyrians in these places, and especially in Hazak, should be treated with utmost severity. And he can interpret it the way he wants. The German consuls also, they knew what was coming in Hazak, and the German deputy consul in Mosul, Holstein, who was concerned, he sent a letter to the embassy in Istanbul, a cipher rather, November 1915, just before the siege ended. I heard that Freiherr and Goltz ordered the 4th Army units to suppress the uprising in Midyat. If the Turkish units attack Azaks, which is another term for Hazak, we have to accept that no Christian there would survive. So you can see that within the German camp, there was some consternation about what the Ottomans were doing and the extent of German responsibility. So it's not black and white. And Evin Goltz Pasha, which is the General Goltz, but it was called Goltz Pasha in the Ottoman sources, that he said, he sent another telegram after that, and he said, the war minister, that is Enver Pasha, he doesn't want the German officials to interfere in this matter. So the Ottomans were very clear about what they wanted to do in that area. Obviously, I don't have 5 minutes anymore. The papers say that. There are a few incidents I want to mention. Hakkari, 1924, and I've written about that, and Nicholas talked about. Assyrians came back from Iraq, but they were pushed out after a period of, I think there was a siege of 12 days. This time the Turkish Republic There were incidents in 1926 around Midyat and Anwarder again. There was insurgents of Assyrians again. And so not only massacres continued right up to 1924 and even up to 1926 in Turabdin area, but also resistance continued, this time against the new oppressive regime. There is a Vatican document from the Secret Archives dated January 4th, 1926, entitled Clarifying the Critical Situation of Christians in Azaks, Midyat, Ain Wardo, Anhel, Mizah, and the whole of Turabin. Now, in part, it states that Assyrians are under attack by the Turkish government forces. They ask them to give up their arms, and if they don't surrender their arms, then they will go to the independence courts, Istiklal Mahkemeleri, and there wasn't much trial if those who know, Istiklal Mahkemeleri was almost extrajudicial sentences, yes. And as I said, the Vatican archives identified, the Vatican letter identified these places in Turabia. So that's 1926. This was, I think, the continuation of Sayfo mentality, which is, I've kind of extended it up to that period. Okay, conclusion. Now, originally I said this was not a civil war. Yesterday there was discussion between Hannibal and David. Was it a civil war or not? Well, I think it probably makes no difference to whether it was a genocide or not. This Assyrian, basically the Ottoman state decided to dedicate its resources to exterminate its Christian citizens, the majority of whom had no means to defend themselves. Anahit Kosheva yesterday said the state identified its own citizens as undesirable. Okay, whether or not it was civil war, which it wasn't, if you compare it with the Greek civil war, two political parties trying to get power, control of the state. This is not the situation. And in this long period, I think Assyrians had to fight to defend their lives, and I think the term resistance apply equally for Urmia, Hakkari, and the regions that I mentioned earlier. Thank you for your time.
Any questions? Please direct only one question per presenter. Yes.
I have a question to Nicholas. So now Assyrians and Chaldeans, they spread all over the world, more than 50 countries, you said. And after leaving from Iraq, and some of them got there today as well, are they actually have maintained the village, tribal, clan identities, and they do something even outside of the region? And then, when they reconstruct their churches, what kind of style do they have?
Well, for the Assyrians from Hakkari especially, as I mentioned, wherever they were settled in Iraq, and it doesn't matter whether they were from the Church of the East or the Chaldean Church, they were settled according to their previous village or tribal affiliation in Hakkari. One example I can give for the Chaldean Church is the village of Sat, or the village of Hazarjot in northern Iraq, who all come from the village of Sat in Hakkari. These identities were maintained even outside in the diaspora. For example, my surname is Al-Jilu, right? So, when I was younger, my father would tell me, don't forget, your tribal affiliation is Jilu, we come from the village of Nara, your clan is Begulawi. Just remember these three things, they're very important. And the church we had back home was Marsawa, so just to remember these things. People from particular tribal affiliations still celebrate the feasts of their saints, of the main saints that they had back home. So if you were from Jilu, you would celebrate Marzaya every year because that was the main saint of the district. If you were from Kochanis, you would celebrate Marshalita. If you were from Marbishu, you would celebrate Marbishu, etc. Or if you were from Bali, you would celebrate Marodishu. These kinds of things. Now, the architecture of the churches in Syria and Iraq up until the 50s, I would say, up until the 50s, the architecture of the churches was largely, the churches were largely constructed from mud brick, and the architecture of these churches was identical to the churches that we see in Hakkari. A single nave church with maybe a sanctuary at the end, with a large door on the left side and a smaller door to the right, exactly the same architecture. But from 1959 onwards, we start to notice that the Church of the East develops this monumental architecture of these three nave basilicas with, three large gates at the eastern end, which is completely not the architecture that existed in Hakkari. So a lot of the villages that I showed, a lot of the churches are actually the new churches that have been built since the 1980s and 1990s. But in many of the villages of the Khabur, the older churches built in the 30s and 40s were still standing when I last visited 5 years ago. And they're identical to the churches in Hakkari.
Other questions?
My question is directed to Nick and Judo. In your submission, you mentioned names as Chaldeans from Urmi or Urmi district. It seems to me that suddenly we Assyrians, by converting to Catholicism, we changed our identity from being Assyrians to become Chaldeans, which they are using as a national name. Would you please clarify that how come we as Assyrians accepted my name overnight to become a Catholic, changed to Chaldean from being an Assyrian? Thank you.
I'm afraid Nicholas is the brunt of my question. Nicholas, I was very interested where you talked about the very encouraging collaboration between Kurds and Assyrians, and what I was wondering whether that is perhaps a percolation of the in recent years, the KRG's government's recognition of minorities and their espousal of the human rights of minorities. There may be still many areas to clarify, but they have taken this policy on, and I wonder whether that has filtered through, as well as perhaps memories of people living together. So whether we're seeing an implementation, well, not an implementation, but the percolation of government attitudes into the grassroots level. That's really the brunt of my question.
Well, my question is to Mr. Danev. It's a question probably is everybody who probably can help giving an answer. The question of resistance. Why the Assyrian people did not have an organized resistance? We are separated in Ainguardo, then in Urmia, but I don't know. Is due to the fact that we depended always on the clerical leaders, so we weren't so organized, or it's just because we were lost and we didn't know what to do?
Maybe we can answer these four when we get the fourth one in.
My question is to Dr. Florence. If I'm not wrong, I believe talking about the refugees in 1915, you gave a number of Assyrians 10,000. Am I right? 10,000 refugees left Urmia. In your speech, you told 10,000. Yes, to Caucasus. I just want to tell you that in Armenia we have an archive, and there is a document which tells that only in January of 1915, just 15,000 Assyrians escaped Urmia. So number is 10,000 for whole year of 1915. I believe it's too decreased. So do you have any kind of information on it? And maybe a second question for both presenters. First I wanted to ask Nicholas, but next, Dr. Rachidonov talked about it too. I would like to know if you have any information about the refugees who went back after the genocide to Hakkari. Because again, in Armenia, in the National Archive, we have a document which says that refugees from Hakkari after 1923, Kemalist regime time, they wanted to go back, and it looks like Soviet government helped them to go back. So if you have any information on it. Thank you so much.
Let's just answer these maybe. Number one is the Chaldean identity. Number two is, are the Kurds of Turkey like a KRG?
Okay, the first question Look, the Chaldean identity is a very contentious one. It's a religious identity, and it's a church identity. Many people like to homogenize the Chaldean Catholic Church and say that they all identify as ethnic Chaldeans, which is untrue. There are many Chaldean Catholics who identify as Arabs and who don't see themselves as Chaldeans even. And there are Chaldeans that still today identify as Assyrians. I mean, the one example is the district of Salamas, north of Urmia, which is predominantly Chaldean Catholic. And the Chaldeans there are known to say, we will give our chickens, we will not give our chickens to Nestorian roosters, but we are Assyrians. Right? So they are Chaldean Catholic, but they're fiercely Assyrian. And wherever they've settled in the diaspora, they forced the Chaldean Church to have its title as the Chaldean Assyrian Catholic Church. So there are still some people there that are strong in their identity. To Dr. Hunter's question about the Kurds in Turkey. There are many Kurds in Turkey and even Hakkari who are very vocal in their support of Barzani and the KRG. However, the majority of Kurds in that part of Turkey are supporters of the PKK or the HDP or its Syrian counterpart, the YPG, and they're more socialists. And yes, they are nationalistic, but it's not to the extent of the KDP and Barzani in Iraq. Unfortunately, yes, Barzani recently has put out some, I'm saying fortunately, Barzani has put out some laws recently that benefit minorities, but for me this is too little too late. Assyrians aren't a minority. The Assyrians are indigenous to that part of the world, and they have been there since...
I don't want to go into that debate about minorities and indigenous. The fact is
the
KRG
Assyrians do not need to rely on the handouts of the KRG and of Barzani.
I think you miss it. Maybe I haven't articulated that correctly.
But the
brunt of my argument is that possibly, and I don't know, and that's all I'm exploring, is it is very encouraging to see this ground roots collaboration, but perhaps, and maybe not, but perhaps it is also part of a larger swell where the KRG government, which are Kurdish, recognise that there are other identities, whether how they articulate those identities is different.
So nothing to do
but the very fact is that there are other peoples living in their regions who have contributed and in return deserve the benefits, etc. Unlike other, and I'm just wondering whether that mentality that is now on an official level is also percolating into the countryside, or whether they're possibly one's chicken and egg or one's egg and chicken.
If anything, it would have something to do with Abdullah Öcalan and what you could call the teachings of Abdullah Öcalan in the PKK.
Do people respond to the government profile as we saw in 1915? Are we finding perhaps a response to government profile today, which is much more encouraging, of course? That's what I'm trying to...
And my answer is that the Kurds in Hakkari and in southeastern Turkey in general respond to Abdullah Öcalan rather than to Barzani.
We have a few more minutes and 4 more questions. So next two are, why is there no unified resistance? Maybe Mr. Jonas can answer or us. And number 4 is the Armenian archive regarding the 15,000 versus 10,000 for the whole year of 2015.
Okay, I'm not sure I give a very comprehensive answer, but I did have this sentence, which I did read in my rush to finish my talk, in the conclusion that the Assyrian community was not united under one banner, given the geographical, religious, and linguistic fragmentation. But the Assyrians and Hakkari defended themselves for several months before the Turkish army brought artillery. So your question is, well, we didn't have an organization. Yes, there was not a political union which coordinated efforts for denomination. So whether we can blame the clergy for that, well, the Assyrians in Hakkari, actually Marshimun organized part of the resistance in the Hakkari Mountains. So I don't think it has to do, be that the clergy is the only administration, but the fact is that there was no political unity among the four denominations. Unfortunately, this is a problem that still occurs. And the other thing is the Assyrians in Hakkari, from the 19th century, in many missionaries, if you read their, like Asa Shogun, for example, they always described as independent state of the Nestorians. Forgive me for the term, but this is the theological term that it's not really relevant for Assyrians, but what it was used. So they were independent, and sometimes, this may not be a fair assessment, they're described as warlike. Well, to that is because they had this love-and-hate relationship with the Kurdish neighbors. Sometimes relations were good, sometimes relations weren't very good, but they were always prepared, and they were independent-minded, and they had guns, better training in order to defend themselves. A cohesive area, mountains are much better than the valleys to defend themselves. So that's the best I could do.
And for the next question regarding the 1918.
Yes, the first to leave the region of Urmia were the Christians from Salamas, with Father Lazarus, whose name was Ducrot, Father Ducrot, and he wrote that there were about 10,000. But 2 days later, another group left from Urmia, which is South Salamas, with Abel Zaya. And when he passed by Salamas, he saw Salamas was empty and there was no person, no more Christian. But from Tabriz, east of Urmia, Christians from Maraha and Tabriz went also to Caucasus, and there were more than 10,000 arrived.
And we have a question about 1923. Did the Soviets aid Hakkari Assyrians in traveling from Armenia to Hakkari again, and then what happened with
Not
that?
just Armenia, I believe from Georgia also, because Soviet government was helping, so it means it should be Georgia and Armenia from Caucasus.
Okay, well,
on my part, I have no idea.
Anahid, your question is whether they came back to Turkey.
Yes.
1924, which I described in some events and quite a lot of Turkish reports as well, was when in 1921, 8,000 Nestorian Assyrians returned with the aid of the British, probably trying to, in the interval, to see whether they can at least salvage something, some kind of autonomy, because Hakkari was a little ambiguous in, I think some people mentioned, the Brussels line. But in between 12 September and 24 September, a huge force arrived and pushed them out. And after that, there was no, to the best of my knowledge, that they did not really to return to Hakkari. So a few individuals may have left, but unfortunately, the Assyrian presence in Hakkari was 1924.
Any more questions? Okay, thank you. We will take a half-hour break.